There would be little for Christians to celebrate at Easter if Jesus had not died. Because Easter is the celebration that death did not have the final word, that even death could not and cannot stop the love of God in Jesus. But just because we believe that to be true, doesn't mean we feel that way when we're in the midst of our own loss and grief. And even if we trust it to be true, it does not necessarily make the experience of loss and grief easier to navigate in our lives. In a world full of rapid change, every change brings a loss to our life. And sometimes we choose the change, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we feel good about the change, and sometimes we really, really don't. And even when we choose the change, we can deeply feel the loss, and often it's a mixture of all of it together. So we feel grief when someone we love dies, but we may also feel grief when the person who does our taxes retires, or our friend moves away to be nearer to grandchildren, or someone we work with takes a new job. We will feel grief when our dog dies, or when we get a diagnosis from the doctor that changes our immediate or future plans. We will feel grief when we lose a relationship or end a career. And what that grief will look like and feel like will be different for every person and every circumstance. And the emotions that accompany us through grief and loss are often messy and complicated and changeable. The Easter story we heard from John's Gospel today makes me think about how Peter was feeling about his loss. His dear friend and teacher and mentor had died, and in the middle of all that, he had not been a great follower or friend. I think he probably felt a lot of guilt and shame about that night when Jesus was arrested. You remember, and someone said, "Hey, didn't I see you with Jesus? You must be one of his followers." And he said, No, I'm not. I swear, I don't even know him. Not once, but 3 times. He betrayed his leader. He couldn't be loyal. And now, how was he supposed to escape that memory? How to escape the idea that if any of this crazy talk about him being actually alive was right, he might have to face him? That might be worse. Fine, he could just retreat into something familiar. Isn't that what we often do if we feel ashamed? Try to find a place that feels safe and comfortable and familiar. Something that could make him feel competent and worthy again. As Debbie Thomas put it in her reflection in Journey with Jesus, Peter flees to his boat, his nets, his vocation before Jesus, as if there is some time or place in his life where shame is not, where his wound is not, where Jesus is not. But of course, there is no place like that. There is no place that Jesus is not. As Mary Poppins explains to the children grappling with the death of their mother in the movie Mary Poppins Returns, you can't lose what you've never lost. Maybe all you're missing lives inside of you. But Peter doesn't know that. And Peter also doesn't seem to know that God doesn't hold grudges or demand punishment for our mistakes. Neither do we seem to know that a lot of the time. So Peter spends this long night trying to catch fish without Jesus. And it doesn't work. Everything he tries merely reinforces the story he's been telling about himself. He's a failure. He catches nothing. And then, Jesus, in stranger's guise, for it seems the risen Christ is never easily recognizable, invites him to change his perspective, quite literally. Now, metaphorically, shame and judgment meet grace. And in that shift of perspective, literally, an empty net finds more fish than they'd ever seen in one go. And then, Peter finds himself sitting face to face with Jesus at a fire with the one he'd denied. It's not an easy conversation they have. God doesn't demand punishment for our mistakes, but does invite us to learn from them. God knows that to heal from our shame, we have to revisit the source of it. But as Brené Brown contends, shame cannot survive being spoken either. And I trust that God will always give us the opportunity to be transformed. So Jesus revisits their past. He speaks of it. 3 times he invites Peter to share his loyalty, not his denial. He can try again. And yeah, the conversation hurts, but it shifts perspective to remind Peter that this failure does not define him. It doesn't define their relationship. In fact, he is worthy. And even in this time of grief and change, there is a pathway forward. There is still meaningful work for him to do. Peter's shame met Jesus' grace, and his grief was transformed. I'm always amazed at the power of grace to transform judgment. Let me give you a little modern, very modern example. I don't know how familiar you are with Twitter, but the social media platform can be known for people making a lot of rather rude and unkind remarks to one another. Earlier this year, the US president made one such statement, and a comedian named Patton Oswalt, also not known for his kind and gentle banter, responded with a similar tone. Then a person named Michael Beatty chimed in with some very mean and personal comments about Patton Oswalt. Now, usually one of 2 things happens when that kind of exchange starts. Either people mostly ignore it and it kind of disappears into the Twitterverse, or, more likely, it starts to go back and forth with all kinds of name bashing and name calling and devolves from there. But in this particular instance, neither of those things happened. Because before responding back, Patton Oswalt went to Michael Beatty's page just to find out a little bit more about him. And what he discovered pretty quickly by reading the tweets was that there was a man who had sent mean criticism his way, but was also a man mired in loss and grief. He was a Vietnam veteran who'd been hospitalized recently for a couple of weeks. And during that time, he'd been in a coma due to diabetes and sepsis. So life was not great for Mr. Beatty. And so rather than engaging with all the negativity, Oswalt flipped the dynamic on its head and responded with compassion. He replied, "Oh man, this dude just attacked me on Twitter and I joked back, but then I looked at his timeline and he's in a lot of trouble health-wise." He went on to say, "I'd be mad too. He's been dealt a bad hand, so let's deal him some good ones. Click and donate just like I'm about to." And then he donated $2,000 to the health GoFundMe page that had been set up for Mr. Beatty. Well, Patton Oswalt has 4.4 million followers. So it's not surprising that suddenly the GoFundMe page quickly hit $30,000. Well, you can imagine Beatty's next reply on Twitter after his mean jabs. Patton, you have humbled me to the point where I can barely compose my words. You have caused me to take pause and reflect on how harmful words from my mouth could result in such an outpouring. In another tweet, he added, Patton Oswalt managed not only to let me slide on a rough tweet to him, but started something that has me reevaluating friendships and productive dialogue, regardless of political affiliation. He's a good man, and I hope I can meet him one day. When grace meets judgment, there is opportunity for transformation. Grace says that there is more to the story. So as we find ourselves navigating our own grief and loss, and the messy and complicated and shifting emotions it brings in this ever-changing world, I hope that we too can make room for grace. Grace to those who make changes we don't like. Grace to those who make it more difficult for us. Grace to those who disagree with our vision for the world. Grace to those who make different choices than we would or want. Grace to those who grieve differently than we do. Grace to those who have done us wrong. And grace towards ourselves for all of the mistakes and the failures along the way. Let us trust that God can help with that, because that's what Easter shows us. That God meets the violence and the cruelty of this world with restoring love. That God meets the grief and the loss of this world with enduring love. Thanks be to God.